Welcome, history buffs. Today we witness the brutal end of medieval warfare's greatest lie. For centuries, the armored knight ruled the battlefield as an unstoppable machine of death. No one believed a ragged mob of starving peasants could ever stand against this steel tide. But a blind commander named Jan Žižka had a ruthless plan to rewrite the rules of combat. Watch closely as simple wooden farm carts transform into a fortress that breaks an empire. To truly understand this devastating conflict, we must examine how wars were fought back then. The heavily armored knight was considered the absolute pinnacle of human combat power. Enclosed entirely in brilliant, shining steel, they rode massive war horses, bred for pure destruction. Their thunderous charge would shatter enemy lines like fragile glass breaking upon solid stone. Poor infantrymen were simply treated as mere fodder to absorb the devastating impact. A starving peasant holding a wooden spear had absolutely no chance of survival here. If you ever faced a heavy cavalry charge on an open battlefield, you inevitably perished. It was a ruthless law of ancient nature, written in crimson across the battlefields of Europe. Wealthy European kings spent incredibly vast fortunes just to fully equip one steel behemoth. They arrogantly believed that God himself favored the men who could afford such heavy armor. This overwhelming arrogance completely blinded them to the changing reality of the world. They foolishly believed that absolutely nothing could pierce their thick plates of polished iron. But absolute pride always comes right before a truly catastrophic and tragic historical fall. Enter the brave Hussites, a desperate group of religious rebels fighting for their very lives. They were mostly just poor farmers, humble craftsmen, and simple commoners from Bohemia. They possessed no horses, no shiny armor, and virtually no professional military training. If you were commanding this humble peasant army, would you surrender or choose a certain demise? Surrender was simply not an option, because the ruthless Crusaders took no prisoners. The Pope himself had ordered a massive, holy crusade to wipe them out, completely, forever. Tens of thousands of elite knights marched towards Prague, hungry for a truly devastating triumph. It truly looked like a completely hopeless situation for the ragged and starving rebel army. The arrogant Crusaders openly laughed at the thought of fighting these dirt-covered farmers. They confidently expected the battle to be fully over before the crimson sun reached its peak. But they completely and severely underestimated the man leading this peasant rebellion. A hardened old veteran who saw war not as a noble game, but as grim mathematics. His name was Jan Žižka, and he was arguably the greatest military tactician alive. Even though he had tragically lost a single eye, he saw the battlefield clearer than any king. Zizka perfectly knew that fighting the heavy cavalry on flat ground was an absolute pure ruin. He desperately needed a brilliant way to neutralize the terrifying speed of the horses. So he bravely led his ragtag forces to a narrow, steep area known today as Vítkov Hill. The steep and rugged terrain acted like a deadly funnel, heavily restricting enemy movement. But natural geography alone would not be enough to stop the impending, massive steel wave. Zizka looked closely at the simple wooden grain carts his people used for daily farming. He envisioned a truly radical defensive machine built from these seemingly worthless items. He quickly ordered his men to reinforce the fragile wagons with extremely thick oak planks. They hammered heavy iron chains to securely link the carts into a massive, solid, closed ring. Historical records state he created an incredible mobile fortress known as a Wagenburg. Safely inside these wooden walls, the desperate peasants finally had a real fighting chance. But a solid wall only delays the enemy. You still need a lethal weapon to truly vanquish them. Zizka cleverly armed his men with modified farming tools, like heavy, iron-spiked flails. Much more importantly, he introduced a truly terrifying new weapon technology to Europe. The primitive hand cannon, a highly crude but deafeningly loud and dangerous bronze firearm. These early guns were notoriously inaccurate and took a painfully long amount of time to load. But pinpoint accuracy does not matter when your target is a massive, tightly packed wall of horses. Would you bravely trust your life to an unproven weapon, or stick to a rusty, old sword? The fateful stage was now perfectly set for a massive clash that would change human history forever. On one side, the arrogant Crusaders, glittering brightly in their wildly expensive steel armor. On the other, dirty farmers hiding behind chained wooden carts on a treacherous, steep hill. The Crusader commanders looked up at the crude barricade and sneered in utter, sheer disgust. They firmly believed their heavy wooden lances would easily splinter the pathetic carts to pieces. They loudly sounded the heavy war horns, signaling the start of their devastating, brutal charge. The earth began to violently shake as thousands of massive armored war horses galloped forward. Zizka stood perfectly calmly, his one good eye watching the terrifying steel wave rapidly approach. He waited very patiently, refusing to give the order to fire until they were incredibly close. The tension was completely agonizing as the thundering hooves closed the final, deadly distance. As the massive armored war horses crashed into the wagons, the sturdy wooden walls held perfectly firm. The arrogant Crusaders were suddenly trapped, their devastating momentum completely and utterly broken. The heavy, rusted iron chains prevented the carts from being pushed aside or easily separated. Packed incredibly tightly together on the narrow hill, the bulky knights could barely move around. Then, Commander Jan Žižka finally roared the brutal command that unleashed pure, fiery hell on Earth. From the narrow wooden loopholes in the wagons, a blinding, terrifying flash of hot fire erupted. The deafening, brutal boom of the crude hand cannons echoed violently across the crimson-stained hill. Thick, choking black gunpowder smoke instantly and completely engulfed the highly confused front line. The primitive, heavy lead bullets tore right through the expensive, beautifully polished steel plates. Even when the brutal shots missed, the sheer deafening noise and fire terrified the poor horses. Massive war horses reared up in blind, chaotic panic, violently throwing their riders into the mud. A fallen knight trapped in heavy armor is like a completely helpless turtle flipped on its back. The angry Hussite peasants seized the perfect moment, thrusting long spears right through the gaps. They used terrifying long iron hooks to drag the struggling knights right down from their saddles. Heavy spiked flails crushed expensive steel helmets with sickening, brutal, bone-shattering force. The supposedly invincible heavy cavalry was being brutally decimated by simple, angry farmers. The Crusaders tried desperately to retreat, but the narrow, steep path was completely and fully blocked. Their own massive numbers became a fatal trap, crushing screaming men beneath heavy iron hooves. The horrific noise of clashing metal, dying horses, and roaring guns was purely and truly demonic. Zizka's incredibly brilliant strategy had turned their greatest strength into a deeply fatal weakness. Every single time the Crusaders tried to regroup, another brutal, deadly volley of gunfire hit. According to ancient historical accounts, the narrow valley was painted deep red with crimson stains. The truly impregnable Wagenburg stood tall, a monument to practical, ruthless, and deadly genius. A simple, humble wooden cart had just defeated the most feared military unit in all of Europe. The devastating psychological shock was far worse than the terrible, massive physical casualties. Proud men who believed God was strictly on their side were completely and utterly broken in spirit. They quickly realized that decades of training meant absolutely nothing against a heavy lead bullet. The grand myth of the unstoppable knight lay completely shattered in the muddy dirt of Vítkov Hill. Zizka calmly watched the routing enemy, his heavily scarred face showing absolutely no mercy at all. He had not just won a simple battle, he had fundamentally changed how ruthless wars were fought. The panicked survivors fled in total disgrace, leaving their wildly expensive gear in the thick mud. They would soon return home to tell horrifying, dark tales of the terrifying, demonic peasant wagons. Never again would a foolish commander charge blindly into a completely unknown defensive formation. The victorious Hussite farmers scavenged the field, eagerly stripping the fallen knights of their vast wealth. An entire era of classic medieval warfare had been violently and brutally extinguished on this hill. The shocking news of this stunning victory spread like a raging wildfire across the whole continent. It clearly proved that smart technology and tactics could easily overcome arrogant, sheer brute force. The simple war wagon became a highly feared weapon, easily dominating battles for many ruthless years. Jan Žižka never lost a single battle, despite eventually going completely and totally blind later. He commanded directly from a wagon, feeling the vibrations of the earth to safely guide his men. The brilliant Wagenburg tactic was a very direct ancestor to modern heavy-armored tank warfare. It firmly established the core concept of mobile fire bases supporting massive infantry maneuvers. And the incredibly crude hand cannon eventually evolved into the highly precise, deadly modern rifle. The glorious age of the knight was effectively over, violently replaced by the dark age of gunpowder. All because a brilliant, one-eyed veteran looked at a humble farming cart and saw an iron fortress. The Hussite rebellion raged on for many more ruthless years, defying the Pope's wrath entirely. Every European monarch suddenly realized they had to completely rethink their tactics. Expensive knights were rapidly replaced by highly disciplined professional infantrymen. This brutal revolution was born purely from utter desperation and an instinct to survive. The legendary name of Jan Žižka still strikes immense fear into the hearts of any invader. He remarkably passed away from a deadly plague without ever losing a single major battle. Legend wildly claims his skin was used to make a war drum, to continue terrifying his foes. The historic Battle of Vítkov Hill remains a powerful testament to absolute human genius. It proves beyond doubt that ultimate strength never lies in the most expensive, heavy armor. True power lies in the brilliant ability to adapt and use whatever tools you currently have. Innovation from cheap items bought a glorious victory. Yet another dark history awaits. Soon we explore a fool who bought the greatest army, only to receive a cruel and tragic downfall. Žižka's wooden wagons proved that raw intellect could slaughter the most expensive armies on earth. Tell me, was this a triumph of peasant genius, or a cowardly way to fight? Comment below. If you enjoyed this journey into brutal history, please like, share, and subscribe for more.